The Germans invented the world's first fighter jet, a machine so far ahead of its time that it could have rewritten the entire air war over Europe. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, or Swallow, was a marvel of engineering, sleek, fast, and deadly. It could reach speeds of over 540 miles per hour, nearly 200 faster than the best Allied fighters of the day. In the skies of 1944, it was like watching a spaceship hunt propeller planes. Allied pilots who encountered it were stunned, could dive, climb, and vanish before they could even react. In a war dominated by air power, this jet should have been Germany's last trump card, the weapon that could tear apart Allied bomber streams and slow the destruction raining down on German cities. But instead of unleashing it as a pure fighter, Adolf Hitler made a decision so foolish it's still studied in military academies today. He ordered that this fighter jet, this masterpiece of speed, be used as a bomber. The Me 262 was designed by Willy Messerschmitt and his team to intercept bombers. Every inch of its frame screamed fighter. Its twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines gave it power that no piston-driven plane could match. The idea was simple. Germany was being pounded daily by waves of American B-17s and British Lancasters, flying high and dropping thousands of tons of explosives. Traditional German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were being shredded by Allied escorts. The Luftwaffe needed something revolutionary to turn the tide. The Me 262 was that weapon. It could climb faster, hit harder, and disengage at will. Allied bombers would have been sitting ducks. But Hitler didn't see it that way. His obsession with the offensive meant that every weapon, no matter its design, had to serve his vision of striking back. He wanted revenge for the bombings of German cities. He wanted a blitz bomber that could swoop in, deliver bombs on enemy cities or troop concentrations, and fly away untouched. To him, using the Me 262 as a defensive interceptor was an admission of weakness, a sign that Germany was reacting rather than attacking. He couldn't bear the symbolism of that. So in his mind, the jet wasn't a fighter, it was a bomber. And that one stubborn decision doomed the Me 262's potential before it even left the runway. The engineers and Luftwaffe leadership tried to convince him otherwise. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most experienced fighter aces, pleaded directly with Hitler. He argued that Germany didn't need another bomber, it needed a way to stop the bombers already destroying its cities. The Me 262, he said, was the perfect answer. But Hitler refused to listen. He overruled the Luftwaffe and insisted that production focus on the bomber version, which required new bomb racks, sights, and structural modifications. These changes delayed production by months Germany could not afford. When the jet finally reached combat units, the war had already shifted far beyond Germany's favor. The Allies had air superiority, radar coverage, and endless supplies of replacement aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding pilots faster than it could train them. And now, their miracle jet was bogged down by Hitler's ego. The bomber version called the Sturmvogel was slower, heavier, and nearly useless in the role he imagined. Carrying just two 250-kilogram bombs, it lacked precision, armor, and even a proper bomb sight. It couldn't dive bomb or carpet bomb. It was simply too fast to aim accurately and too fragile to absorb ground fire. It wasn't a bomber at all. Meanwhile, the Allied bombers it should have been intercepting were free to keep destroying Germany's factories, oil plants, and transportation networks. By mid-1944, the German fuel industry was in ruins. Entire cities were flattened. And when Me 262s finally appeared in significant numbers as fighters too, they lacked the fuel to fly. Ground crews would often have to siphon aviation fuel from trucks or even other planes just to get one or two sorties in the air. It was the ultimate irony. The world's most advanced aircraft stranded because its creator had misused it from the start. Imagine for a moment what might have been. In 1943 or early 1944, before the Allies achieved full air dominance, squadrons of Me 262 interceptors could have torn through the bomber formations. A single Me 262 could take down several heavy bombers in one pass before the slower escorts even realized what was happening. The B-17s flying in their tight boxes would have been slaughtered. The psychological effect alone, watching hundreds of bombers vanish in flames from a weapon they couldn't. Even chase could have forced the Allies to rethink their bombing campaigns. The delay in Allied air superiority could have given Germany time to recover its fuel supplies, reinforce defenses, and even stall the Allied advance in Western Europe. But Hitler's decision made sure that scenario never had a chance. Even when the Me-262 did fly as a fighter, it was too little, too late. By mid-1944, Germany's airfields were under constant attack. Allied fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, patrolled the skies all the way to Berlin. Me-262s were fast in the air, but on takeoff and landing, they were extremely vulnerable. The turbojet engines needed long runways and several minutes to reach full power. Allied pilots learned to wait near German airfields, swooping in to destroy the jets during their weakest moments. Ground crews would hide the aircraft under camouflage nets or inside hangars, but it rarely helped each time one was lost. Replacing it became harder. The production numbers tell the story. Around 1,400 Me-262s were built, but fewer than 300 ever saw real combat. Most sat idle due to lack of fuel, spare parts, or trained pilots. In contrast, the Allies produced tens of thousands of conventional fighters and bombers each year. The Luftwaffe simply couldn't compete on Quantität. The one plane that could have restored some balance was trapped in Hitler's fantasy of revenge bombers. It's easy to underestimate how much difference timing made. The Me-262's design was ready as early as 1942, but delays caused by Hitler's interference pushed its deployment back by almost 2 years. In war, 2 years is a lifetime. By the time squadrons like Jagdgeschwader 7 received the jet, the Allies had already perfected their strategies, radar networks, and long-range escorts. Had the Me-262 appeared in 1943, it would have faced a very different sky. There was also a deep contradiction in Hitler's thinking. On one hand, he demanded technological miracles from his scientists, wonder weapons that could reverse Germany's losses overnight. On the other, he constantly interfered with those same projects, redirecting them toward his own emotional impulses rather than strategic needs. The Me-262 wasn't the only victim of this. The V-2 rocket, another groundbreaking invention, was used to terrorize civilians instead of targeting critical infrastructure. Again and again, Germany's most advanced technologies were squandered, chasing symbolic victories instead of practical ones. The Me-262 could have been a nightmare for Allied air forces. Even in its limited use, it proved nearly unstoppable in direct combat. Allied pilots described trying to intercept them as like standing still. A single burst from its 430mm cannons could obliterate a bomber. Some units, like Gallen's own JV-44, achieved impressive kill ratios despite being heavily outnumbered. But these successes came too late to matter. The factories building the jets were bombed. The pilots who could master the jet's quirks were dying in droves. The war had moved on, and Germany's miracle machine became a symbol of wasted potential. When American and British engineers examined captured Me-262s after the war, they were astonished. The design directly influenced post-war jets like the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15, which went on to dominate the skies in the Korean War. The Allies learned from Germany's innovation and from its mistakes. The Me-262 proved that technology alone doesn't win wars. Strategy does. A perfect weapon in the hands of a flawed leader is still a failure. In the end, the Me-262 stands as one of history's greatest what-ifs. It was the jet that could have changed everything, but instead became another monument to arrogance and poor judgment. If Hitler had listened to his generals and engineers, if he had allowed the Me-262 to be what it was meant to be, the skies over Europe might have told a very different story. If you're fascinated by the small decisions that caused massive failures, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we uncover how ego, pride, and poor strategy shaped the course of history. By 1944, the skies over Germany were no longer contested. They were dominated. Allied bombers darkened the horizon almost daily, reducing German cities, factories, and infrastructure to rubble. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been gutted. Its veteran pilots were dead or exhausted, and its once superior planes were now outdated against the endless waves of Allied aircraft. At that moment, Germany desperately needed something revolutionary, something that could shift the tide, even slightly, in their favor. That weapon existed. It was already built, already flying in prototype form. It was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was fast, sleek, and decades ahead of its time. But under Hitler's misguided leadership, its potential was sabotaged before it even entered the war. The Me-262 could have been the weapon that forced the Allies to rethink their bombing strategy. It could climb faster, fly higher, and outrun anything in the sky. In mock combat trials, it was shown to be untouchable by the best Allied fighters, the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, or the P-47 Thunderbolt. The jet's speed advantage was so dramatic that conventional dogfighting tactics became obsolete. But the Me-262 never reached its potential as an interceptor, not because of technical failure, but because of one man's stubborn misunderstanding of the war he was losing: Adolf Hitler. When engineers at Messerschmitt presented the jet to him, they envisioned it as the ultimate defensive fighter, capable of taking down Allied bombers before they reached German cities. But Hitler, obsessed with offense and revenge, demanded that the Me-262 be redesigned as a blitz bomber, a fast attack aircraft capable of striking ground targets and retreating before enemy fighters could respond. To him, the word fighter was defensive, weak. He wanted to hit back. He wanted a Stormbird that would deliver a psychological blow to the Allies. This decision was catastrophic. The conversion to a bomber wasn't simple. Engineers had to modify the wings to carry bombs, reinforce the airframe for added weight, and adjust the center of gravity. These changes crippled the aircraft's primary advantage, its unmatched speed and agility. The added payload reduced its range and made it sluggish during takeoff and landing, leaving it vulnerable to Allied fighters during the most critical moments of flight. The Luftwaffe pilots who tested the bomber version were furious. They called it a waste of genius. By the time the interceptor version was finally allowed to enter production, the damage was done. Months had been wasted on Hitler's bomber fantasy. The Luftwaffe could have had squadrons of jet interceptors ready to defend against the Allied bomber streams that devastated cities like Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden. Instead, the production delays and redesigns ensured that when the Me-262 finally reached the front lines in mid-1944, it arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a real difference. To understand how disastrous this was, imagine the air war over Europe at the time. Allied bombers, protected by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang, could now strike anywhere in Germany. Factories producing weapons, fuel, and even food were being systematically destroyed. Every day, hundreds of aircraft crossed German airspace with near impunity. The Luftwaffe tried to resist, but most of its planes were slower, underarmed, and poorly maintained. The Me-262 could have torn through those bomber formations. Even small squadrons could have caused devastating losses, forcing the Allies to reconsider their air strategy. Instead, the Luftwaffe found itself defending empty skies with conventional aircraft, while its wonder weapon sat in hangars, being re-engineered into something it was never meant to be. The pilots who flew the Me-262 later described their frustration in vivid terms. They knew they had the ultimate machine, but not the numbers, not the fuel, and not the strategic clarity from leadership to use it properly. The internal conflicts within the German command made matters worse. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter aces, begged for the Me-262 to be deployed as an interceptor. He understood the war's reality. The Allies had complete air dominance, and without control of the skies, Germany's war machine couldn't survive. Galland argued that the only way to even the odds was to unleash the jet against the bomber streams. But every time he brought his plan to Hitler, the Führer dismissed him with the same obsession. The Me-262 will be a bomber. It will strike terror in the enemy's heart. But terror was no longer a weapon Germany could afford. The war was already shifting toward survival. Allied air raids weren't just destroying infrastructure. They were breaking the will of the German people. Industrial production was collapsing. The jet's purpose should have been to protect what little remained. But instead, precious time and resources were wasted, fulfilling Hitler's fantasy of offensive power. Even when a few interceptor versions finally entered combat, the impact was limited. Pilots like Walter Nowotny achieved some success, shooting down multiple Allied planes in a single sortie. But these victories were isolated. There were never enough jets to change the outcome. Each Me-262 required rare materials, precision manufacturing, and advanced engines that burned out quickly. Fuel shortages made it even harder to keep them operational. Allied bombers, ironically, often destroyed the factories producing them before they even rolled out onto the runway. The tragedy of the Me-262 wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. It represented everything wrong with Hitler's leadership during the final years of the war. Arrogance, denial, and an obsession with image over strategy. Instead of listening to his generals and engineers, he made decisions based on pride and emotion. He couldn't accept that Germany was losing and refused to prioritize defense over aggression. That mindset cost him the one weapon that could have at least delayed defeat. One can imagine what the war might have looked like if the Me-262 had been mass-produced as an interceptor from the start. Allied bombers might have suffered catastrophic losses over Europe, slowing the bombing campaigns and forcing the Allies to reconsider their approach. It wouldn't have won Germany the war. Their industrial and manpower shortages were already too deep, but it could have extended it, significantly possibly altering the timing of the Allied invasion or even delaying the fall of Berlin. But history doesn't reward potential, it records results. And the result was that one of the most advanced aircraft ever built became a victim of one man's ego. The Me-262 could have redefined aerial warfare. Instead, it became a symbol of squandered genius, trapped under the weight of political vanity and military delusion. It was the right weapon in the wrong hands, and by the time it finally took flight in meaningful numbers, the war it might have changed was already lost. When it came to the Me-262, Hitler's greatest enemy wasn't the Allies, it was time. Every month of delay, every unnecessary modification, and every contradictory order drained the Luftwaffe of its last chance to regain control of the skies. The Me-262 could have been a dominant force as early as 1943. But Hitler's obsession with turning it into a bomber and his constant interference in its production created a disaster of delays. What could have been a revolutionary advantage became another example of how one man's pride cost his nation everything. The Me-262 project started with immense promise. The prototype first flew in 1942 using piston engines, then later with its proper jet engines in 1943. Engineers knew they had something extraordinary, a plane so fast and advanced that it made all other designs obsolete. Even test pilots reported feeling like they were flying a machine from the future. But instead of accelerating its production, the project fell victim to Hitler's micromanagement. He changed priorities mid-development, issued contradictory commands, and overrode expert advice from his own air ministry. The design teams were stuck in an endless loop of confusion, working 1 week on a pure interceptor version, the next on a bomber conversion, and then back again when reports showed the modifications weren't practical. The engineers at Messerschmitt's Augsburg plant tried to keep up, but they were building an aircraft that no longer had a clear purpose. The constant redesigns caused supply chain chaos. Each new version required different parts, different weights, and new test flights. The Jumo 004 jet engines, already fragile and short-lived due to material shortages, needed adjustments to handle the bomber configuration. The result was endless rework. Valuable time that could have gone towards scaling production was instead wasted trying to satisfy Hitler's fantasies about a revenge bomber. This indecision filtered all the way through the Luftwaffe's command structure. Generals like Erhard Milch and Adolf Galland understood what the Me-262 represented, lifeline for Germany's dying air force. By 1943, Allied bombers were crossing into German airspace daily, escorted by long-range fighters that could dogfight over Berlin and still make it home. The Luftwaffe was crumbling. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Galland and his peers pushed for immediate deployment of the jet as an interceptor to counter these raids, but their requests kept hitting the same wall: Hitler's obsession with offense. At a meeting in November 1943, Hitler officially declared that all future jet aircraft were to be built as bombers. His words were final. The generals left in frustration, realizing that their most advanced weapon had been reduced to a vanity project. The engineers had to stop their existing plans and reconfigure the Me-262 4 bomb racks, a bomb sight, and extra load-bearing capacity. But here's the problem. The Me-262 wasn't built for bombing. Its high speed made precise bombing almost impossible. The aerodynamic changes ruined its handling at low speeds, making it vulnerable during takeoff and landing, the two phases when Allied fighters already had the advantage. Even worse, the delays meant that when production finally began, the Allies had already learned how to dominate the air. By mid-1944, their radar network covered most of Western Europe. Their escort fighters had near-unlimited range, and their bombing accuracy had improved dramatically. If the Me-262 had been introduced just a year earlier, it could have decimated the bomber formations before those improvements were in place. Instead, when it finally appeared in small numbers, the Me-262 had to fight against an already overwhelming force. It was like sending a handful of lions into a forest that was already burning. There's a bitter irony in how the production delays unfolded. The Me-262 could have been mass-produced in 1943 with relative efficiency. The designs were mature, the factories were capable, and the need was desperate. But while Hitler argued over whether it should drop bombs or shoot down planes, the Allies bombed the very factories building it. The Augsburg plant was hit multiple times, destroying tooling and halting production. Skilled workers were killed or scattered. Every raid added weeks of delay. Every delay gave the Allies more time to perfect their strategies. By the time Hitler finally gave permission for the Me-262 to be used as a fighter in mid-1944, it was already too late. Germany had lost control of the skies, the fuel supply was collapsing, and Allied armies were advancing on all fronts. The few Me-262 squadrons that did form, like Jagdgeschwader 7, had to operate under impossible conditions, short on fuel, outnumbered, and under constant attack. Pilots had to conserve every drop of fuel just to make it home from a mission. Many jets never even left the ground because there wasn't enough kerosene to start them. To understand the scale of what was lost, imagine if just 500 Me-262 fighters had entered service in early 1943. The Allied bombing campaign, which depended on tight formations of heavy bombers, would have been a slaughter. The Me-262s for 30mm cannons could tear apart even the toughest B-17s in seconds. With that speed and firepower, a handful of German pilots could have disrupted entire bomber wings. Fewer bombers would have reached their targets. Fewer cities would have burned. German industry might have survived longer. But because of Hitler's delays, none of that happened. The Me-262 arrived on the battlefield when Germany no longer had the strength to use it effectively. The psychological effect of the delays also hurt the Luftwaffe's morale. Pilots and engineers watched helplessly as the air war turned against them. They knew the Me-262 existed. They knew it could change everything. Yet it sat grounded, tangled in bureaucratic chaos in Hitler's whims. Every new Allied raid that burned another city felt like proof of how leadership failure, not enemy superiority, was dooming them. Some engineers even risked punishment by pushing small batches of fighter-configured Me-262s into service ahead of orders, desperate to prove their value. But by then, production was too fragmented to make a difference. Another critical consequence of the delays was the training gap. Jet propulsion was completely new technology. Pilots needed time to adapt to the Me-262's unique handling characteristics, the slow engine throttle response, the fragile turbines, and the long takeoff runs. Because production was delayed, so was pilot training. When the jets finally rolled out, there weren't enough skilled pilots ready to fly them in combat. Many who tried crashed during takeoff or landing. What should have been a revolutionary leap became a logistical nightmare. And while Germany struggled, the Allies weren't standing still. British and American intelligence had already learned of German jet experiments through reconnaissance and captured reports. They accelerated their own jet projects, like the British Gloucester Meteor. By the time the Me-262 entered service, the gap between Germany's secret weapon and the Allies' next generation of technology had already begun to close. The advantage that once seemed insurmountable was vanishing. What makes this story so tragic isn't just the lost potential, it's that the people building the Me-262 could see the disaster coming. They begged for more autonomy. They warned that delays would cost Germany the war in the air. But Hitler couldn't help himself. He wanted control over every detail, even when he didn't understand them. His orders were based on instinct, not strategy. Every hour spent arguing about the bomber version was an hour that Allied factories spent building thousands more planes. By late 1944, as Allied bombers darkened the sky and the Luftwaffe was all but shattered, Hitler realized his mistake. He approved full fighter production, but it was far too late. The Allies had air supremacy so complete that Me-262s had to take off under constant threat. The jets still terrified the enemy when they appeared, but they were no longer a game changer. They were a desperate last gasp. The delays that crippled the Me-262 project serve as a brutal lesson in leadership failure. It wasn't technology that doomed the jet. It was ego, indecision, and a refusal to listen to experts. The Luftwaffe didn't lose air superiority because its engineers couldn't innovate. They lost it because their leader didn't understand time as a weapon. If you enjoy uncovering how pride and poor planning shaped history's biggest blunders, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historianware. We break down the moments when bad leadership turned genius into disaster. The Messerschmitt Me-262 represented one of the most extraordinary leaps in aviation. History, a machine that could have changed the course of the air war had it been used correctly. Capable of speeds over 540 miles per hour, it could outclimb, outearn, and outrun anything the Allies had. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, a weapon that should have shattered the Allied bomber formations that were reducing German cities and factories to rubble. Instead, through a combination of bureaucratic delay, engineering diversion, and Hitler's obsession with offensive weapons, Germany squandered its single greatest technological advantage of the war. When the Me-262 first flew in 1942, it was revolutionary. The aircraft's twin Jumo 004 turbojet engines gave it performance unmatched by any piston-engine plane in existence. In test flights, Luftwaffe pilots were stunned by its acceleration and power. The Me-262 could reach speeds that made it virtually untouchable, too. Allied fighters like the P-51 Mustang and the Spitfire, in theory, a squadron of these jets, deployed early and used properly as interceptors, could have torn through the Allied bomber streams that hammered German industry daily. But Germany's leadership, particularly Hitler, failed to understand the strategic significance of what they had. By 1943, the Allied bombing campaign had become relentless. American B-17s and B-24s attacked in daylight with escort fighters, while the British bombed by night. The goal was simple: grind down Germany's industrial output, destroy its fuel supplies, and break civilian morale. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, was being shredded. Its pilots were overworked, its aircraft outnumbered, and its training programs collapsing. In this desperate context, a fast, high-climbing jet interceptor should have been the Luftwaffe's salvation. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces, immediately saw the Me-262's potential and urged its mass production as a fighter. But Hitler had a different vision. In mid-1943, when the prototype was demonstrated for him, Hitler was impressed but confused by its purpose. Instead of seeing it as a defensive weapon to protect Germany from bombers, he saw it as a fast, light bomber, a blitz bomber that could strike Allied ground targets. He believed that offensive weapons were the key to victory. To his mind, the war could still be won by punishing blows rather than defense. He demanded that the aircraft be modified to carry bombs. His order was final: no jet fighters, only jet bombers. That single decision crippled the program. Engineers at Messerschmitt, under enormous political pressure, were forced to redesign parts of the aircraft to accommodate bombs. The modifications seemed minor reinforced wings, a bomb sight, and structural adjustments, but they degraded the aircraft's performance. The jet lost part of its speed advantage and balance. The time spent on redesigns delayed production by nearly a year, precisely when Germany needed the jets most. The Luftwaffe's high command protested, but Hitler was obsessed with symbolism. He wanted a weapon that could strike fear into the Allies, not just defend German skies. As the months passed, the Allied air campaign intensified. American bombers were now escorted all the way to their targets and back by long-range P-51 Mustangs. German factories, rail yards, and oil refineries were being destroyed faster than they could be repaired. In some industrial regions, fuel production fell by 90%. Pilots were being trained on gliders due to shortages of aviation fuel. It was at this moment that the Me-262 could have made the difference, if it had been mass-produced and used purely as a fighter. When the first operational Me-262s entered service in mid-1944, they were still officially classified as fighter bombers. The pilots had to carry out absurd missions, attacking bridges, trains, and troop concentrations. Targets that were nearly impossible to hit accurately with bombs dropped at jet speeds. The aircraft's strengths were wasted: its climb rate, speed, and heavy armament for 30 millimeters. Mk-108 cannons were perfectly suited for shooting down bombers, not for ground attacks. The Luftwaffe pilots themselves knew this. Many disobeyed orders, abandoning bombing runs to engage Allied bombers instead. They called themselves jet fighters, not jet bombers, in defiance of Hitler's mandate. The results when the Me-262 was used as an interceptor were staggering. Even with limited numbers, it demonstrated unmatched killing power. A single Me-262 could destroy several B-17s in one pass before the American escorts could react. The heavy cannons fired explosive shells that ripped through bomber formations, igniting fuel tanks and tearing wings apart. American pilots reported the jets appearing suddenly, streaking through their formations at impossible speeds and vanishing before they could fire back. But these moments were rare. The total number of Me-262s that ever reached operational combat units was too small to make a difference. Fewer than 300 were fully combat-ready at any time. The delays caused by the bomber conversion meant that mass deployment did not begin until late 1944, when the war was already lost in the air. By then, the Allies had complete control of Western Europe. They bombed Me-262 factories and airfields before the aircraft could even take off. Jet fuel shortages further limited operations. The engines themselves were fragile, lasting only about 25 hours of flight time before needing replacement. A problem made worse by Germany's collapsing logistics. For every jet that took off, 2 or 3 sat grounded, waiting for parts or fuel. When Hitler finally allowed the Me-262 to be used as a pure fighter in late 1944, it was far too late. The Allied bomber streams were massive, hundreds of aircraft deep, and now accompanied by radar-guided escorts and reconnaissance planes that could detect takeoffs and intercept the jets during their vulnerable climb phase. The Allies had also learned to bomb Me-262 bases directly. Runways were cratered daily, pilots were often forced to take off under fire or land on damaged strips. Ground crews hid the jets under camouflage netting and trees, trying to keep them safe between missions. Even so, the Me-262 terrified Allied airmen. The Americans called it the Stormbird. They could not deny its superiority in the air. In a one-on-one fight, no Allied plane could match it. But wars are not won by isolated technological marvels. They are won by numbers, logistics, and timing. The Me-262 had arrived at a moment when Germany no longer had the means to exploit it. Had it entered service as a fighter in 1943, when Germany still held resources and experienced pilots, the effect could have been catastrophic for the Allies. The strategic bombing campaign might have been halted, or at least blunted, delaying D-Day and extending the war by years. Instead, it became a weapon of desperation, a symbol of brilliance undermined by arrogance. The irony is that Hitler had always prided himself on intuition. He believed he understood the nature of warfare better than his generals or engineers. But his insistence on using the Me-262 as a bomber was not a stroke of genius. It was a fatal misunderstanding of reality. By 1944, Germany was on the defensive. It needed protection, not offense. Yet Hitler's psychology could not accept that. He was still chasing the dream of blitzkrieg, the idea that victory came from surprise attacks and aggressive strikes. The result was the misallocation of one of history's most advanced aircraft into a role it was never meant to fill. Pilots who flew the Me-262 understood the tragedy better than anyone. Men like Walter Nowotny and Adolf Galland knew that they were flying a weapon that could have changed everything, but they were doing so months, even years, too late. Many of them died taking off or landing. When the vulnerable jet engines made them easy targets for Allied fighters circling the airfields, the Luftwaffe's last generation of aces fought not for victory, but for survival, outnumbered and unsupported. By the war's end, the Allies had captured several Me-262s intact. Engineers from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union studied them obsessively. Within a few years, jet technology had reshaped global air power. The Me-262 became the ancestor of the modern jet age, influencing the design of the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15, the very aircraft that would duel over Korea just a few years later. But in 1944, its brilliance was wasted. In the end, Germany had built nearly 1,400 Me-262s. Only a fraction saw combat. The rest were destroyed in bombing raids, captured, or never made it off the assembly line. The story of the Me-262 is not one of technological failure. It is a story of how strategic blindness can destroy even the most revolutionary advantage. Hitler's obsession with the offensive turned a war-winning interceptor into a misused weapon, and Germany's final chance to challenge Allied air dominance was lost forever. The Me-262 stands today as a symbol of how brilliance can be undone by arrogance. It was not just another piece of machinery, it was a glimpse into the future of warfare. The jet was decades ahead of its time, capable of outrunning anything the Allies could put in the sky. But in Hitler's hands, that potential was squandered. His obsession with control, his refusal to delegate to experts, and his inability to grasp the realities of modern air warfare turned one of the greatest technological breakthroughs in military history into a wasted opportunity that hastened Germany's defeat. The tragedy of the Me-262 was not in its design, but in its misuse. Every military leader who saw its test flights understood what it could do. It was the perfect interceptor, fast, deadly, and unstoppable when used correctly. Even a small fleet of Me-262s operating in 1943 or early 1944 could have inflicted devastating losses on Allied bomber formations. The Luftwaffe could have regained some control of its airspace, making large-scale strategic bombing far more costly for the Allies. Yet that never happened, not because of lack of skill, but because of one man's ego. Hitler's fixation on offense and striking back, rather than defending, blinded him to the realities of the air war. He believed that war was won through bold attacks, through shock and destruction. Defense was something he considered weak, reactive, even cowardly. So when his generals presented the Me-262 as a defensive interceptor, Hitler dismissed it. He wanted it to be a blitz bomber, a fast aircraft that could carry bombs over Britain and deliver symbolic revenge for Allied air raids. He ignored every technical limitation and every expert warning that this role made no sense. The modifications for the bomber version destroyed the plane's balance and wasted precious time by forcing engineers to retrofit a sleek, fast jet into something it was never meant to be. Hitler turned efficiency into chaos. Production slowed, resources were diverted, and all the while the Allies were producing thousands of new aircraft each month. They didn't have the world's first jet, but they had overwhelming numbers and complete control of the skies. The delay in deploying the Me-262 gave them the breathing room they needed to crush German industry and prepare for D-Day. When the Allies launched the Normandy invasion in June 1944, they did so under skies they completely controlled. There was no German Air Force left to meaningfully oppose them. Had the Me-262 entered combat in significant numbers a year earlier, those skies might have looked very different. Allied bombers might have struggled to maintain supply lines. Fighter escorts would have been torn apart. The invasion itself could have faced catastrophic air losses. The war might not have been won by Germany, but it could have been prolonged by years, changing the entire trajectory of post-war Europe. Instead, the Luftwaffe's power was broken, its best pilots dead, and its miracle weapons still trapped in production bottlenecks. When the Me-262 finally entered combat in late 1944, it was already too late. Only a few hundred were ever operational, and even fewer were available at the same time. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, spare parts, and pilots. Allied bombing had crippled Germany's transportation networks, making it nearly impossible to deliver supplies or transfer aircraft to where they were needed most. The few Me-262s that took to the sky terrified Allied pilots. They were faster, deadlier, and nearly impossible to intercept in open-air combat, but they couldn't change the strategic picture. By then, Germany was collapsing on every front. What makes the Me-262 failure so tragic is how predictable it was. Every expert around Hitler warned him. Willy Messerschmitt, the plane's designer, told him it was never meant to be a bomber. Luftwaffe generals pleaded to release it as an interceptor. Even Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, urged him to prioritize the fighter version to defend German cities and factories, but Hitler dismissed them all. He was convinced his intuition was superior to their experience. That arrogance cost him the air war and, ultimately, the war itself. The psychological element of this blunder is just as fascinating as the military one. Hitler's decision-making in the later years of the war was increasingly driven by denial. He refused to face the reality that Germany was losing. Every defeat was explained away as betrayal or lack of faith in his vision. The idea of using the Me-262 as a bomber fit perfectly into that fantasy. It was an offensive weapon, a way to strike back to prove that Germany still had the power to attack. But it was also delusional. The Reich no longer had the fuel, the pilots, or the industrial capacity to sustain any kind of offensive campaign. The Me-262, as a bomber, was nothing more than a psychological crutcher, symbolic gesture from a leader who couldn't accept reality. In the end, the Me-262 blunder did more than just waste time. It demoralized the Luftwaffe, drained vital resources, and gave the Allies uncontested control of the air. It ensured that the bombing of German cities could continue unhindered, that Allied supply lines across the Channel remained open, and that the D-Day invasion could succeed without serious opposition from above. In a war where control of the sky determined the outcome on the ground, Hitler handed victory to his enemies through his own stubbornness. When historians look back at the Me-262, they often describe it as the weapon that could have changed everything. But in truth, its story is less about lost potential and more about human failure. The jet was proof of what German engineers were capable of, even under impossible conditions. Yet, the brilliance of the creators could not overcome the blindness of their leader. The Me-262 was born in genius and buried in arrogance. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history: technological brilliance undone by ego, innovation crushed by control. The Me-262 could have been Germany's salvation in the air, a weapon that rebalanced the war. Instead, it became a monument to one man's inability to listen. And that failure didn't just lose Germany, the skies it accelerated its defeat on every front. By the time Hitler finally realized his mistake and ordered the jet to be used as a fighter, the war was already lost. The Allies were on the Rhine. Soviet tanks were rolling toward Berlin, and the skies above Germany belonged entirely to the enemy. The Me-262 soared too late, too few, and for too short a time. It was the perfect weapon deployed in the most imperfect way, a reminder that no amount of technology can save a leader who refuses to face reality. In the final months of the war, Me-262s still managed to score victories against Allied bombers, but they were fighting a hopeless battle. Pilots often flew without enough fuel for a return trip, launching desperate missions from crumbling airfields while enemy fighters waited overhead. The jet that could have changed history became a symbol of futility, brilliant, deadly, and tragically late. The Me-262 blunder captures the essence of Hitler's downfall, a leader so obsessed with control that he destroyed his own advantage. His inability to delegate, to trust experts, or to think strategically ensured that even Germany's greatest technological achievements became meaningless. In the end, the Me-262 wasn't the weapon that saved the Reich, it was the weapon that revealed how far the Reich had already fallen. If you want to keep exploring the moments where arrogance, poor leadership, and missed potential changed the course of history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historianware. Every story reminds us that even the smartest machines can't save the dumbest decisions.